This is Rocky Snyder. At the tone, leave your name and message and I'll get back to you.
And in this ALCS in particular for the Red Sox since that 1918 season. Here it is, ground ball to second. Reese, the Boston Red Sox have won the pennant.
Welcome to this episode of the RockFit Files. I'm Rocky Snyder, and we've been exploring all season long the flow motion model, which is this model of movement of how humans walk through space. The gait cycle broken down into various phases we'll call primary phases, and what every joint does through three-dimensional space through the entire cycle. Now, with me today is one of the students of Anatomy and Motion, which is the workshop we learn all about the flow motion model designed by Gary Ward. And this guest, his name is Shawn Kitzman. Now, Shawn is kind of unique in this way that the guests that I've brought on in previous episodes are maybe manual therapists like body workers, or maybe they are strength coaches or personal trainers. Well, Shawn's actually bridged the gap from being a manual therapist and transitioned over a movement therapist, but more specifically as it relates to baseball. In fact, he has a podcast known as The Pitching Nerd. So if you want more insight about baseball, all things related, I don't recommend it highly enough. Go to the Pitching Nerd podcast. So Shawn, welcome on the show.
Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate returning the favor. You were a great guest on my podcast. So, and also, you know, even though we live so far away from each other, it's a great time for us to catch up and just kind of, you know, chew the fat a little bit.
Oh, without a doubt. Now, obviously, for those listening to the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or Anchor, wherever you're listening right now, you can't see the fact that Shawn and I are both sport and baseball caps. For those on YouTube, obvious, but we don't get along very well when it comes to baseball because, you see, I was raised in Boston, and it's just hard to get that out of your blood. I'm a Red Sox Nation kind of guy. Meanwhile, this guy over in Minnesota, I don't even know why you don't have a Twins cap on. You've got a Yankees cap on. Like, that's what, when we go camping and we can't find a restroom, all we do is we grab a Yankees cap. It's easy to use, and it's very versatile. And then we give it back to the Yankee fan, actually.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, though. I mean, all you degenerates from Boston, I mean, you know, you barely can fog a mirror and count to three. So, I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all, you know?
Damn straight. All right. Now that we got that hatred out of the way. Oh, that's funny. So now you just told me something off the air that you were doing a lot of manual therapy for some time. Obviously, with restrictions being what they are right now, you can't really do that, or the restrictions are lifting and you kind of do that now. But you've just kind of gotten away from all of the body work, and only use it when you really need to, because you've really transitioned ever since taking the Anatomy and Motion course. You obviously were one that delved in deep and have really taken on the approach much more in the movement base, right?
Yeah. So when pre-Anatomy and Motion, when I took it in 17, I had been 17 years in practice doing manual therapy. I went to massage therapy school back in 1997, got done in 98, kind of broke into the industry in 2000. And all along, like, I was trying to figure out how to make my work more manual based, because at the core, I am a martial artist. I've been practicing martial arts since 1992. A lot of the way that I understand the body moves is from 28 years of training martial arts. And when I saw Anatomy and Motion, and I saw what Gary was doing and what Chris was doing, and then like watching senior students like you and Monica and some of the other, and Ryan and some of the other folks, I was like, see, this is what I'm looking for. You know, I tried yoga and I tried to do some other things, and nothing, they were all, everything had really cool ideas, but I didn't see the motor control change really quickly. And from the body work that I did, because I was always trying to integrate body work with movement re-education, kind of like, okay, so I used to work back in Michigan. I used to work with a lot of strength people and kettlebell sport people. And so they would come in with a shoulder injury or something like that. And, what we would do is we would just go into the gym. All right, we've cleaned up this pattern. I used to use a little bit of NKT with it, or neurokinetic therapy. We've cleaned up this pattern. Now overhead press. Let's see what it looks like. Let's see what it feels like. And then once I took anatomy in motion, and I was actually working with a lot of triathletes at that time as well. So that's the whole reason that I went to anatomy in motion, was because I was working with triathletes. And I actually, I worked with one of the best bicycle fitters in the country, Chris Balzer, bicycle fit guru. And he was actually on the bike. And then I saw his foot do something. And then I saw his talus do something that I knew it shouldn't do. And I was like, I got to figure this out. And I'm starting to run into a lot of feet and knee and ankle issues that I'm just not able to solve quickly enough. And then I decided I was going to take anatomy in motion.
And so you came out, was it in Vancouver, or where were you?
Yeah, I took it in Vancouver in 17, and
Okay.
then I came right back again in March of 18 to Santa Cruz, because I had, the funny thing about anatomy in motion is it really kind of reminded me of all of my educational pathways, things that I really like. I'm really the smartest person in the room. Like, I looked around, like, I Chin. I was listening to I Chin in Vancouver, and I was like, where in the hell did this guy come from? And by the way, if he wasn't so darn nice, I'd take him outside and beat him up because he's too damn smart already, right? Meanwhile, we had like the great knuckle dragging group of the Midwest and the East Coast, But what I knew from previous continuing education courses was that if I could grab a hold of something and take it home and start to work on it and then test the results, it will tell me whether or not I want to go forward with it. And all I really did is I just came home and I made people pronate and supinate their foot. That's all I did. When I came back, Marcia, who I sublease from, she goes, well, what do you think? I was like, well, I don't know. I'm going to make everybody pronate for about a month and a half and see what happens. And all of a sudden I started to see things and I started to get a better handle on the foot. So by the time I came back again in March, I was like, okay, I have a better idea of what's going on now. There's so much dense information here. I could come back 17 more times, and each time I would find something else out a little bit different. So.
Yeah, and that's the truth. I mean, the system is so complex, and we can simplify it as much as possible. And yet within that simplicity, there's interwoven complexity. So you can keep going back further and further and getting more out of it each time. And nonetheless, it comes back to the basics. Can you pronate? Can you supinate? So, all right. So you've made this transition kind of out of the manual therapy, but I'm curious that you kind of explained a little bit of how you used it initially, where I'm just going to see people pronate and supinate. But did that transfer into the manual therapy in any way?
Yeah. So here's what I did. From doing the work I had done previously, I have kind of like a hierarchy of how I kind of create prioritization of patterns, right? So client's pain is kind of first, how they feel, then their movement, and then palpation, and then some muscle testing. And so what I would do then is I would put the model against those 4 criteria. So I had very high expectations for what the work should do if I was able to apply it the way that I saw Gary and you and Chris apply it. And luckily maybe not luckily for all of you, but luckily for me, which gets me coming back, right? But luckily for me, I was able to, in my very infantile understanding of what was supposed to happen, I was able to start to see, client's pain improved. It got their movement improved. When I would palpate the tissue, the high tone tissue would then downregulate and return to a little bit more normal. And then most of the time, when I would just put them into motion, lining them up skeletally, the muscle test flipped as well. It would go strong, or it would break the pattern. And so then, like when I first started, that was like what I would do. And most of my clients know I'm a fairly eccentric person. So like when you come into my practice, you just get what I want to do. and hope that it works out in the beginning. But but I don't care if you liked X, Y, and Z modality. That's not what I'm doing. So I'm an artist. You come and get this art, and that's all you get. And so by the time that, most of the people, because we had been here for 3 years in Minnesota, and by the time that I was here, I had kind of cultivated this group of clients that was trusting enough that I could guinea pig them. And then everybody new that came in, they all got some anatomy and motion.
Yeah, they didn't know any better. They weren't having any expectation compared to your previous clients. So with those previous clients, I'm curious, when it came to your normal modalities of what you were using prior to anatomy and motion, and then you overlaid it onto it, what was the major difference that you saw? Obviously, there was efficacy and you came back, but what was it that by applying the flow motion model or the principles of anatomy and motion did you see with the patients or your clients?
Well, so one of the things I look for is outcomes. I'm known as someone who works relatively fast in what I do. It was funny because when I was in Vancouver, and actually when I came back to Santa Cruz, nobody believed that I did half-hour sessions, and that's what I was doing at the time. I was doing half-hour sessions. This is just objectively how I've kind of created my practice over 20 years. I can prioritize stuff very quickly and kind of like chip through stuff very quickly. So, but what I really liked with it was that it gave the client a lot more empowerment because they could move their body in a way. And also a lot of times, and I could see like all of a sudden, you've had that happen where they get 2 or 3 reps into a phase and then all of a sudden you see it, right? All of a sudden that knee starts to move differently. All of a sudden that hip starts to move differently. And if you're thorough enough with the control groups that you create with the check-ins and some of the other things, it doesn't take long for clients to go, what just happened? And like, wow, that's really different. And that's what I tell my clients, after we do something, you're going to walk around and tell me what you notice. If anything, is there any difference? And I have a guy actually, 25 years of Achilles pain, runner, had a tear, mild tear, wasn't enough to kind of pop it off the heel or anything. The first 5 times I had him pronate. So I went through my standard of because I knew that this guy came in not buying a thing that I was going to do with him because he's had this for 25 years, right? Sure. I'm going to give this guy a last chance, right? Yeah. And so, so when we first started palpating, if this is his Achilles, he had pain in an area about that big with a very, very acute pain source of probably where his original tear was. Because you could feel
basically a length of about 2 inches up above the heel and right in the middle.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So the whole length of the Achilles, as it attaches up into the calf and comes off of the heel, was painful. So I had him pronate once, walk around. I could see his foot was starting to take a little bit of shape. Had him pronate again, come back, and I start palpating now because he didn't notice any different, right? 3rd time, he goes, well, what am I supposed to notice? I'm like, I don't know. When we get something, you'll know, and I'll know. I don't know what it will be for you. But it continued the pain continued to localize, and then that Achilles spot started to also become less painful as well. And so at the 5th time, he walked around and he goes, oh, that's different. I'm like, well, bingo, that's what we got. That's what I wanted. And so I saw my client's brain, that the motor control or their muscle memory change very quickly, and I didn't have to do anything to them. All I had to do is introduce them to parts of their bodies and movements that they didn't know that they had.
Well, you bring up a really good point because there's so many people that we'll just call them chronic pain sufferers, for lack of a better term, but the people that continually have these patterns of movement that irritate areas, and even those patterns may shift, those irritated places will stay, they may change a little bit, but they stay for the most part where they are. And it's become so normalized that they think this is just how it's going to be. And of course, they've tried many other modalities over time, whether it's chiropractic or the the conventional Western approach to medicine and pain, anti-inflammatories, painkillers, whatever, rest, ice, elevation, all those things we hear about, or they've gone to other body workers. So why would they think, like, first they're coming in reluctant, they're going, this is just another guy that's going to kind of give me a stretch or tell me to do this or that, and it may feel better a little bit, but then it's, I'm not going to be, and you can feel they have already convinced themselves that this is not what I need. And then when you get that person to experience a new pattern, like you say, something different, you guide them into it, and that outcome is different, man, you just see their whole demeanor. Like they have just, it's almost like you've not scared them, but you've just startled them into reality in a way, going, whoa, wait a minute. Everything I've thought of up until this point is not relative anymore, because I honestly thought I was going to have to live this way for the rest of my life, and you just showed me I don't have to live this way. I mean, that carries over not in just the physical world, but what's their demeanor, their personality like? What do you see in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because this guy went from ardent skeptic to believer like instantaneously, because it's like, and so then once we had it happen, I was starting to wedge him up a little bit, and then I really started to wedge him up a little bit more so he could get into better pronation, and I started to really kind of coach him deeper into the movement, right? So he got more tissue response, and the next time he walked around, he goes, well, that's different too. And I'm like, what's that? He goes, my Achilles doesn't hurt as much. And like the look on his face, like he couldn't believe it. And then of course that's happened with a variety of other people. Like I just had a guy that was referred to me by my buddy Chris, posterior tendonitis, post-tib tendonitis, has got an insert, has been doing all the foot stability exercises, the whole nine, getting, what did he have done? Some very invasive, not very pleasurable methodology to release the tissue, right? And I'm like, okay, man, like, and history of low back pain, all classic can't pronate on that foot, symptoms as we know it, right?
Yeah.
Did he? I think he also had a meniscus surgery on that same knee. So classic, just not pronating, right? Or his body isn't moving into that shape ever. Can't run. He's got to run, walk 5 miles. And also his pain. These are the best ones, and these are also the toughest ones. His pain wasn't really high when he came in. So now I'm having him do all this crazy stuff with the wedges and, all these things. And I'm like, dude, you just gotta be patient with me for a bit. Right. So I'm like, okay, so now we've done this. He starts to feel some change in the way his foot's moving. I can see his foot starting to open up and move better. But he didn't have any kind of classic things that I could use as markers because his pain was really low. He wasn't really tender to palpation. And so, but the next day, because I'm like, go run and see what happens. I don't know. Like the worst thing that can happen is you're still sore, Right. He goes to run the next day and he sends me a text and he goes, all right. He goes, well, I usually walk, 5 miles. I just ran 3. Now he goes, of course, then here's the but statements, but it wasn't very fat. I'm like, I don't care. Yesterday you were 2 days ago, you walk 5 miles. Today you ran 3. And now he's up to running 10 miles, on hard days, he's up somewhere around 50 miles a week. Right. So, yeah, I mean, like the thing that the psychology or the way that they respond is like, well, this is kind of weird, but it's also really kind of cool. And when my assessments are correct and we can kind of work together and putting them in the correct shapes, their body and their brain kind of like accepts the work, then it's amazing. I mean,
honestly, it's like the movement that you kind of discern as what they really need, getting that position, getting things to move in a proper sequence or timing, shall we say, that light up the muscles and everything else in a certain way. That is a key that unlocks their physical and mental prison cell that they have been bound into. Because suddenly when you get people that experience that, and that freedom of movement, and they don't put it into words, they just suddenly start doing things that they were not doing before. Or they may express it and they say, gosh, I had one guy said, I think I want to go swimming. I had another guy that gave him something that freed up his knee. And next thing you know, he's back to doing like high jump in the studio. He's making that approach. It's just amazing. They're like, okay, that did it. You can see the freedom just occur right then and there because they are not mentally or physically the prisoner that they were before. It's fantastic. So, okay, so let's take this and let's just fast forward a little bit now that you've gotten away from the manual work, the body work so much so, and you've just really embraced anatomy and motion and the movement kind of approach to it. How was that and why? Why did you make that transition and how has it been?
So, well, we have to go back to my martial arts training and really look at biomechanically when I started to see, and I started not even biomechanically, when Gary started talking center of mass and he started describing center of mass. And I remember being in Vancouver, of course, as people can probably tell, I'm very shy and not very energetic very.
Unbelievable, but come on out of your shell.
Yeah. Thanks, Rocky. I appreciate that. But I said, I remember saying like, oh shit, this is judo. This is all this is. Like, that's all it is. I mean, if you really understand, and if you look at Feldenkrais, I guarantee you that if we could go back and if we could get a hold of Bill and Ted or Doc Brown and we could jump in the DeLorean or the phone booth and we could take Gary back and talk to Moshe, I guarantee you there would be so much overlay in what they say. And so it made sense to me. It intuitively made sense to me. And then when I was using it in my own body, it all of a sudden I started to be able to unlock things that I wasn't able to do. And a couple weeks ago, classic example, it was nice out. It was on a Sunday. My son and I were fooling around on our skateboards. I was trying to do a trick I haven't done in, oh my God, probably 30 years. And the only time I come close to landing it, I fall straight on my ass, right? And previous to that, or previous to the last 3 years of what I've done with my body, through a combination of anatomy and motion, and then my friend Marcia Swalson, who I mentioned previously, she's a restorative exercise specialist or a res under Katie Bowman. So between anatomy and motion and what I've taken from Marcia, I should have been down for the count because I came down like on the outside of my right tailbone because the board came out from underneath me and I just sat down, right? And I should have been out. So I wake up the next day, start moving my pelvis around as I'm in bed, going, okay, let's see what kind of damage control we got to do today. Got up, I was a little stiff, walked into my kitchen, made some coffee, still kind of seeing how I felt, see how my body woke up, shifted about 4 or 5 times, good to go. My cousin saw it and he goes, dude, how are you doing? Right? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm good. So those experiences along with my clients' experiences, and then giving me the bigger insight into how the body is actually working and the chain of events that go from the foot to the head has been, for me, it's super fun because essentially this is like judo or like jiu-jitsu, because that's what my martial arts obsession has been for the last 7 years. This is like jiu-jitsu, just in the reverse order, and that I'm not trying to break your stuff, right? But there's so much carryover. Like I remember like trying to understand transverse plane in a way, and I all of a sudden I got it, and I looked at Gary and I was like, oh, all right, I get this now. And then there was someone there that had done a little bit of jiu-jitsu. I was like, yeah, this is just like a heel hook. This is how the foot is working, right? And it just completely made sense to me. And so I was able to overlay those things together. And so it's been a lot of fun because it's like, all I do is pretty much watch people move around and then take all of the previous years of movement assessment that I've had from martial arts.
Well, and then that leads us right into baseball here. So you've taken that and you've overlaid it in there. Of course, you're a baseball nut, but how is that? I mean, it sounds like you have basically mapped out whether it's a baseball swing or a baseball pitch, what mechanics. I would say that you're much more inclined to look at, obviously the pitching nerd, you're looking at pitching mechanics and basically taking the flow motion model of how the joints move as a walk, but applying it to pitching, because essentially pitching is just you're stepping off the mound and you're hurling a ball. So we're just looking at the same mechanics, only with exaggerations in different areas, right?
Yeah, for sure. So the easiest way to compare the difference between pitching and walking is that at the end, when you get to front foot strike, as a pitcher, you want your throwing arm still back facing towards second. So I'm rotating back towards whatever throwing arm that I'm at. When I'm walking forward in that front foot strike, I want to be striding towards my opposite leg, right? So that's the big difference between pitching and walking. It's also one of the reasons why, there's two reasons why guys have a really hard time with mechanics. The first reason is that it's direct opposition of how we're actually how we've been programmed to move through space if you have good mechanics. The second thing is that when you're in the infield, and infield is a lot more like walking because you step and throw when you're in the infield, right? And that's the thing that you do repeatedly up until you decide, or someone decides for you, that you're going to be a pitcher. And so the model has been a tremendous asset for me in being able to map out pitching mechanics and realistically make bold assumptions and leaps that, quite frankly, most of the industry doesn't even understand, because most of the industry comes from it as either a retired pitcher or a performance coach. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to increase velocity. And when I say this, I say this as kindly as I possibly can, but it's a truth though, right? So sometimes this hurts. They increase velocity despite whatever happens to the pitcher, because when you look at statistically, 74% of all youth pitchers will have arm and shoulder pain.
Yeah,
dude, I come from jiu-jitsu. If 74% of the guys got hurt in the room, a school would shut down.
Yeah.
That's, if 74% of the people in your gym got hurt, you'd be out of business. And so, but because they come at it, and here's where I think the innocence is, and here's where I don't think it's neglect per se. They just don't come at it from an idea that mechanics can change. You can teach somebody to change mechanics. And then B, most of the world doesn't understand that as soon as we start moving, as Gary says, joints act and muscles react. And so they're still in this idea of, when the guy's throwing and his shoulder rotates in, it's part of his chest muscles that are rotating in. No, that's not the case. He's in motion now. His skeleton is traveling, and it's dictating how his muscle tissue is going to respond. And so that's a real hard one.
Where his posture and where his position is really going to dictate even more of that. It's like, these individuals, these coaches that you speak of, it's almost like the same kind of mentality that people with chronic pain, this is just the way it is. This is how it's going to be. You want to throw a ball, your shoulder and your arm's going to get beat up. But why is, so that needs to be kind of shaken from its roots and get those rotten apples to fall out. So where are you in that process? Obviously you've got the pitching podcast, the Pitching Nerd podcast, but Do you get a lot of inquiries? Obviously, probably locally, but what's that like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see is that um, people get they're curious. I just actually just had an assistant coach reach out to me to do actually like, hey, look, I want to talk to you. I had an assistant coach from a college reach out to me yesterday, um, and there's a lot of education to be done on it. My kind of target market or my niche, the way I got into pitching or working with pitchers is that I had my friend Marcia referred me a baseball pitcher who had some knee pain, and I had been looking at pitching mechanics a little bit and thinking about it, and I started to like as I was watching I was watching a baseball game. I started to look at mechanics a little bit and how guys were moving down the mound, and I was like, oh, I think I have this figured out a little bit. And so I told this kid who pitches at a Division I college. I said, well, hey man, I said to Marcia actually in passing, I said, and he was there. I said, I think I've got the foot figured out for pitching mechanics, and I think I have the lower half figured out. And she goes, oh, really? I said, yeah. She goes, yeah, because he was kind of like big time in me a little bit, you know? And so he goes, well, what do you think about my foot? And Marsha's a Pilates instructor for part of what she does. And she sees him he was seeing her for Pilates. So he stands up, no shoes on. I'm like, oh, you have a hard time doing this. How do you know that? I said, well, look at what your foot does, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, hey, man, I got to go to lunch because I got to split. So I got to go to lunch. I did the old takeaway, right? And so he reaches out to me, right? And so then he and I went through the last 2 years of kind of putting together this model and watching his mechanics. He's working with another coach right now because this coach can kind of help finish him a little bit with because I didn't pitch, so I don't know how you hold. I mean, I know I can watch a YouTube video and tell you what a grip for a slider looks like or what a four seam looks like or a two seam, but I've never thrown one a lot, so I don't know, you know. So, but it's funny because this other coach is like, man, you know, when he came, his pitching mechanics look really good, and like it's something he was gifted. And I'm like, no, I can show you a video from a year and a half ago where he didn't look that good. And so he and I put to get this together, and he was willing enough to guinea pig with me as well. And so I get a lot of interest. I also go against one of the strongest used tools right now in baseball. And so that's an interesting thing. So, because I've gotten a little bit of pushback from local coaches and even like coaches from outside of Minnesota. And they come at it from like increasing velo. And I come at it from, I want to improve mechanics so there's less of a chance for injury. And oh, by the way, if we do that, you're going to move more efficiently. If you move more efficiently, there's probably a pretty good chance that you're going to add velocity. And so because we come at it from two very different ends, they're very interesting conversations. They're a bit like flat earthers. So.
Well, that's just it, because we're movement specialists.
Yes.
We're not technical coaches, and there's
Correct.
so many techniques that you can coach, but there's only one pure way that the skeleton is going to move.
For sure. Yep. Yeah, and as Gary has pointed out really well, you know, when you get into athletic endeavors, you're going to break the model, right? So there's things that a pitcher has to do that he won't do when he's walking because it's a different outcome. Right, you want a different
returning a ball across the net as they're driving laterally. We're not going to see that as certain things in the gait cycle. However, all of those movements are predicated on the grandfather of them all, which is gait. So we can, and if that core is not moving in the ideal, efficient fashion, then all those other movements based upon that will suffer as well.
Yeah, and the other thing too that's interesting about pitchers that a lot of people don't think about, and the reason why pitching works so well for the model is that pitchers start and stop in the same spot, every time. So after the guy leg lifts, he's going to end in the same spot. There is zero variability from that. I mean, unless the mound is really beat up and you slide a little bit, but other than that, or maybe, you know, for kids, for younger kids, the mound is a little higher, it's a little bit lower. Maybe the mound is they're throwing off a flat or, you know, flat ground, or this mound was a little bit higher and the other one. I mean, those are the only variabilities.
Yeah,
so
I'm
it's
curious. But the variability of the mound itself is that you've got an individual who normally would step on a fairly level platform, they would strike and they'd move on to the next thing at the same elevation. But you're stepping from one place and you're stepping down. So I'm curious, does that create, obviously it's going to create greater impact and demands on deceleration, but
Yep.
But does that increase pronation mechanics because of that? I mean, have you seen, what do you see?
Yeah. So I preset my guys. So we preset the skeleton. So I have them supinate their foot. I have their knee slightly flexed, externally rotating towards second. The pelvis rotates towards second. It's kind of in a quasi, depending on the pelvis or depending on the pitcher. It might be a little bit neutral. It might be a little bit anteriorly tilted. Their rib cage is extended. I've got them just a little bit of rotated towards their drive leg or towards second. Because what I want them to have, what I want to have happen is I want them to be able to hold their upper half as their pelvis comes down the mound for as long as they possibly can. Now, what happens, and where a lot of guys run into trouble, if they can't keep that external rotation on that hip, or on the femur, but on the hip, and they can't, and that their lower half goes too quick, they go from a, you know, from whatever, however they randomly set their knee up into a valgus knee, or the knee rotates towards home really quick. Then what you see is they get really rotational, because as the knee internally rotates quick, the hip's going to internally rotate quick, and then it's just going to slam into the pelvis. You will, if you understand how to look at movement a little bit, on most cases, like chicken wing, Chris Sale, that's his name. Chicken wing, right? Yeah,
Ouch.
yeah.
Wow.
Spaghetti noodle.
Just got to throw that in there, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. A little slam on the Red Sox. That's fine. Go for it.
If you look at his mechanics, he goes valgus really quick. And what you'll see is that his pelvis and his rib cage rotate at the same time. And he has a very long arm angle. And also then he gets into this very externally rotated elbow here. And he doesn't really get into a good pronation. What he winds up doing is the hand will pronate, will start the movement, and then you'll see a lot of extreme kind of extension on the elbow.
So instead of the sling effect of the position between the rib cage and the pelvis swinging that torso around like a golfer would, he's getting the whipping action of the arm and shoulder. That's not going to last too long.
No. And unfortunately, I mean, for guys like Sale, he's gotten away with it for a long time. It'll be interesting to see how, when he comes back, what he does with his mechanics. Because he could be like the other guy on your team too, Evaldi, who just seems to have every other year, he just has Tommy John. And if you look at Evaldi's mechanics, so during COVID, I actually started to look at between 2015 to current day. Well, there's 107 or 108. I'd have to go back. I haven't went through this season, but until like the 2019. So 2015 to 2019, there was 105 guys that have had Tommy John, and so which is
in all of Major League Baseball.
Yep.
In that time.
Yep. And so so let's put that into context. You're talking about in Major League Baseball, there's 360 positions for pitchers, right? Sure. Roughly. Right. So 105, 360. I'm not a mathematician or a rocket scientist, but I know those are pretty close numbers, right? But if you look at all of those guys, a high percentage of them, they all have similar characteristics in their drive leg or in their base leg that they throw out of. Their leg everts, their foot everts too quick. Their knee goes valgus and internally rotates too quick. And then instead of creating that sling, their pelvis and ribcage goes together and they create this very whipping action, which at different points in time in baseball was favored, right? Like you remember about 10 years ago when Lincecum was the darling of the league,
Yeah.
If you look at Lincecum and you look at his mechanics, oh my God. If you understand anything about movement and you can't see train wreck with that, holy crap, you got some problems.
Well, and that comes down to a lot of the strength conditioning programs that they're putting forth, in my opinion, too. Like we could talk about the NFL, where I understand it's 11% of NFL players going to experience ACL injuries, whether it is a career ending or season ending or just pulled out for a quarter. It doesn't matter. There's going to be an ACL injury. And so if it's that prevalent, right, there's a mode of thinking that's going to say, well, that's just it, it's impact and everything. But most of those ACLs are actually not involving blunt force trauma, no impact.
Sure.
They moved. They couldn't decelerate the forces. It's just like an arm being slinging a ball through the space. No one's tackling the pitcher. So these are mechanical issues that are creating so much pent-up energy in one area that it gets overwhelmed and cannot decelerate properly. And the next thing you know, we're seeing things like Tommy John surgery, which, by the way, of course, stats have come out showing how young kids are that are going Tommy John. So really what we're saying is we're on the fringe until that knowledge becomes much more acceptable and mainstream. And then the next thing you know, we're no longer on the fringe. This is what people are going to be seeking out. So we're just we're not waiting on the sidelines because we're creeping onto the playing field right now. It's just that not everybody understands human mechanics or the gait cycle, because if they did, this crap wouldn't be happening as much.
For sure. And so my target market is youth pitchers, because I recognize that I'm not going to, change the MLB, right? There's too much money out there with a certain company out of Ohio and a certain pitcher who happens to pitch for the Cincinnati Reds, who cut his finger on a drone. I won't name names, but I think I've given you enough, right? There's a lot of money tied up in that certain company, in these certain methodologies of how they just prescribe of how to increase velocity. So I can't fight that. And I know a guy that has tried to fight that a little bit, and it's gotten a little litigious. So I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in is taking, before I took anatomy and motion in the late 2000s and early teens, I worked with a ton of elite level youth athletes back in Michigan. I traveled with a nationally competitive boys soccer team for 3 seasons. And one of the things that I was able to, when working with the kids that I worked with, I helped them understand their bodies a lot better. And so my goal is to make my clients, particularly my younger clients that I work with now, insufferable. If you come to them and tell them that X, Y, and Z is supposed to happen, they know their body well enough and why they need to know that, to know if you're full of crap or not. And so my hope is that my son's 14, my hope is that my son's generation is, because they're going to go play and they're going to retire and they're going to go out and be coaches and dads and things like that. And my hope is that I can that's kind of my legacy there, right? Like if I can impact that group, then I'll change baseball.
That's it. Exactly. And the nice thing is that it's those coaches at that level that are a little bit more accepting of information or guidance, because like the football team last year, my daughter was on the high school year, they welcomed me on, and we changed their programming around to the point where they didn't really have any injuries, which was fantastic. And then, getting on podcasts like yours and others and talking about the flow motion model and how it pertains to strength conditioning. I've gotten a couple of calls from NFL athletic trainers or strength coaches. So they're listening, they're out there, and they're willing to. So we're slowly, you just keep planting those seeds and realizing, if you really want to keep those $1 million contract players on the team healthy and you really want to win a championship, you might want to think outside of the conventional realm that you've been delving into already that hasn't really produced what it is you want. So.
Yeah, and with pitchers, like, I'm really convinced that if the individual wants to work hard enough, I can get anybody to 90, right? So if the sequencing's good and they want to work hard enough, I can get you to 90 if you want to put in the work, because you see guys who aren't big that throw hard, but those elite level athletes, what do they typically do? They typically have, obviously they're very fast twitch, but a lot of the times when you start to look at their movements, intuitively they have large amounts of pieces right. Like when you look at Chapman, his drive leg is really good in how he sequences. Now, he does a couple things with his upper half that I'm like, I wouldn't coach that, but that also is that he can get away with it because he's Aroldis Chapman, right? So, the amazing thing about pitching is like, you don't have to be the strongest or most athletic guy on the face of the planet to be able to throw hard, right?
No.
Because it's a series of skills that you go forward. Like, it's not like, my son is going to be 15 in a couple weeks, and, he's trying to get to 110 pounds, right? So, it's not like I can say, hey, Gabe, if you just work a little harder, buddy, you could be 6'6" and 320, and you too can make the NFL, right? I mean, like, that's not possible for him. But, like if he decided that he wanted to spend some time working on pitching or something that had where mechanics really mattered, you can change that. It's why they say jiu-jitsu is a superpower for nerds, right? So, like, jiu-jitsu is just a series of events until you get to a submission.
Uh-huh.
That's all it is. Now, obviously, there's some variability there because you have a resisting opponent, but still, every choke has to follow the same hierarchy. Like, the same things have to happen.
Now, I'm curious, with the pitching model, though, we're talking about a very one-sided action. You don't have too many pitchers these days that will go southpaw as well as right hand.
Right? Yeah, there's only
So,
a couple, right? Yeah.
There aren't too many, and they're still going to favor one side more than the other. But still, I kind of think about my days of analyzing golf swings with Titleist and all that, and hearing about the long drive champions, the guys that could hit the ball like you would not believe. Most of them, interestingly enough, coming from Canada at the time, where in the off season of not hitting long balls, they would be playing hockey or ultimate frisbee with their opposite hand. So they were really working on the counter rotation of, say, what a baseball pitcher would be. So I'm kind of curious. This is kind of like one of my last questions here is that, do you look at that at all? Like, what are the mechanics of them throwing with their right arm, if that's their dominant side? And then I want to see what you look like throwing with your left arm, and just see what is the difference there. Would that matter to you at all?
I think it could. Getting the buy-in for that would be pretty steep. How do you convince a 15-year-old that, hey, look, you got to go do something that you're going to be really bad at and get good at that? And also, like, convincing a parent, hey, you're paying me X amount of dollars. I want you, but I'm going to have your kid throw left-handed, right? And by the way, I mean, like, as a left-handed person, right-handed people can't really do much things well with their left hand. So trying to get a right-handed person to do anything other than maybe pick their nose is pretty hard to do.
I had no idea until this point in time that we were left-handed brethren.
I knew that because I saw you. I picked that out really quickly.
Wow. Yeah, and here I've just always hated the fact that you're a Yankees fan, and now I've found a way to like you. This is amazing. Hey, Shawn, this has been great. I really, I wish I had another hour. But I've got a wife and kids, and
I get it, man.
They only give me so much time a day to talk to friends, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to talk. If people want to find out more about, obviously, the Pitching Nerd podcast can be heard on almost every major platform: iTunes, Spotify, Anchor, and the rest. But if they want to, if you got some youth baseball players in the Minnesota, St. Paul, Twin City area, well, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so the best way to get a hold of me, the thing that I put the most content on is Instagram. And if you go on Instagram and just look up the Pitching Nerd, that's a great way to contact me because I'm very, very active on that platform.
And you're too young for Facebook? Are you too young for Facebook, or do you do that too?
I do Facebook, but my audience is too young for Facebook.
Ouch. Okay.
So there's no 14-year-olds on Facebook anymore. Like, my son's like, Dad, no, not Facebook. you know?
That's where you get
So,
the parents and the grandparents, right?
yeah, I also do I work with guys remotely as well.
Oh,
So,
great to know. So we can go online too. So it doesn't
yep,
mean that you have to be in the Minnesota area, anywhere across
correct,
the nation for that matter.
correct.
Yeah, look up Shawn Kitzman. Shawn, this has been great, man. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, man, thanks so much, and we'll have to do it again soon.
If you'd like to find out more information about the flow motion model, anatomy and motion courses, or Gary Ward himself, pick up a copy of his book, What the Foot, at findingcenter.co.uk. And while you're at it, pick up a copy of my book, Return to Center, where I take the flow motion model and apply it to strength training and conditioning. You can get a copy of that at rockysnyder.com. Thanks for listening.